where do the continuing revelations about Jimmy Savile and the failed Newsnight report leave victims of sexual abuse? The National Association for People Abused in Childhood have told us that since the start of October, they've had 7,898 calls to their support line about abuse in general. They'd normally expect 1,500 to 2,000 in the same period. They say that around 40 of those calls were specifically about Savile. The NSPCC tell us they've now had 260 calls to Childline specifically about abuse linked to Jimmy Savile, and a further increase in calls about other abuse allegations. The Metropolitan Police has confirmed they've now spoken to 130 of the 300 victims who've come forward with allegations by Savile. They've also arrested 3 men in connection with this. All 3 are currently on bail. And Surrey Police, where Jimmy Savile is alleged to have targeted young teenagers at the Duncroft Approved School for Girls, say they've had a big increase in the number of abuse allegations they've received in the last month and a half, although they couldn't give us specific figures. The Children's Commissioner for Wales, Keith Towler, has told this programme that as a result of the now discredited Newsnight report into allegations against a senior politician, he's been contacted by 36 people, all of whom say they were the victims of abuse as children, 22 of them linked to the Brineston Care Children's Home. And this morning we've heard that police in Manchester investigating allegations of historical sexual abuse are looking into 17 separate complaints made since the 28th of October. 2 men have been arrested. Let's talk to 2 people about this. Kevin Cook says he was abused by Jimmy Savile when he was 9 years old after his Cub Scout group appeared on Jim'll Fix It, and he's waived his right to anonymity to speak to us this morning. Good morning, Kevin. Welcome to the programme.
Good morning. Thank you.
Also with us, Mark Williams-Thomas, the child protection expert and former police detective who led the investigation into victims of Jimmy Savile for ITV's Tonight programme. He's currently filming a follow-up programme. Mr. Williams-Thomas, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Where do you think all that's happened in the last 6-8 weeks or so leaves victims of abuse now?
Well, I think it's incredibly positive, and those figures you've just given borne that out, because what we're now moved into a position where people are far more confident to come forward and report, and I hope that is a legacy that comes out of the programme. You know, I created that programme and managed to get it to air, but let's be very clear that the only reason that that programme came about is because of the strength of the 5 women who gave up their anonymity to a degree, and in some degrees completely, in order for us to tell that story. It was a very strong programme. It put evidence out there, and as a result of that, we've now got the Metropolitan Police, the Commander of Metropolitan Police, clearly coming out and saying that Jimmy Savile was a predatory child sex offender, of which there are in excess now of 300 people that have come to the police, and indeed other charities have received that as well. So I think we've moved into what's described by some as a watershed moment, and I hope that it's given confidence to people to come forward. And I know, in addition to those figures you've given, that the police forces, of which there are 43, almost every single one of those, there are reports in regards to historic child abuse. So those are allegations that are being made now about abuse that's happened in the past, has significantly increased. That has to be a positive step, and I think we've moved now into an era whereby I hope victims, not all of them, but a large majority of victims have the strength to come forward. And I have to say, I'm working closely with Operation Youre, which is the Savile investigation. I have total confidence in them. They are determined to get to the bottom of this, and more so in relation to people who are currently alive. They are actively pursuing considerable lines of inquiry, some that I've given them, some that they are aware of themselves and have been reported, and that's very positive.
Kevin, you first came forward on the 15th of October. Once you'd gone public with your allegations against Jimmy Savile, what effect did that have on you?
Well, from a personal point of view, it was just like the world lifted off my shoulders. Obviously, at the beginning of the story, it was all girls coming out and females, which made it hard for me. Then the minute when I heard that it was a male, that there was another alleged abuse victim, it just made it the easiest thing in the world for me to do after 37 years. And, it just became, like I say, the easiest thing to do.
And you did a number of interviews in the media, but just before that, several days before that, once you'd heard about a man saying that he'd been abused in Jersey, you then found the courage to tell your wife, who up until that point had no idea.
No, she never had an inkling, never had a clue. When I told her, she was just like, in a state of shock.
And what did she do with the information you'd given her?
Within 5 minutes, she was on the phone to the police in the other room, without my knowledge, telling them.
Mark Williams-Thomas, you're in contact with dozens of people who say they've been abused by Savile. How are they generally at the moment?
Well, I think there's obviously different elements. If I talk first of all of those people that were in the programme, I've been in regular contact with them, and the one thing that we were very clear of is to offer the aftercare for them, because of course they were going to be subject to a considerable amount of media, and indeed that's happened to the degree that the media have chased, certainly one of them down the street trying to talk to them, and that's a really difficult thing. So we've offered them, and I've been in very close contact with them, offering them that support. Both myself and the producer, what we agreed was that we would split them up and that we would look after individually 2 and 3, and we would take care of them. And that's what we've done. We've continued to remain in contact. But for them, we must remember that whilst in one way it's incredibly positive that they've been allowed to tell their story and it's encouraged others to come forward, but we've also got to be mindful that the impact that it has to them on a day-to-day basis. I've spoken to them, and indeed some of them have been very upset when they've talked to me and said, I'm having to live this every single day whilst it's going, whilst I'm seeing it in the newspapers. They still fully accept and are so pleased that this is now out there in the open, they're being believed, but it's quite hard for them. And for others that have come forward, for them it's now a position, as Kevin says, it's the weight that's been lifted. Finally, somebody is listening to me. I can now tell what has happened and I can put it out there. And for those people who have come forward and said that, they feel very positive now. They feel that actually they can start to get their life back in order again. And I think that's great. And if there's one thing that comes out of our programme that enables people to come forward, then all that hard work that's been put into it is absolutely worthwhile.
And Kevin, after your wife contacted Essex Police, I think it was, then the Metropolitan Police came to see you personally, didn't they? What were they able to say to you about your allegations?
Well, when the officers interviewed me, they'd said, obviously they'd spoke, it was quite early on in the inquiry and they'd spoken to other people, but the main thing was for me that I felt believed, like that was, an important thing for me, and that some of the stuff that I'd spoke to them about, they'd heard before, and obviously they did explain to me in my personal case that because no one else was involved, that there was nothing they could actually do.
Although there was a witness, you say, to the abuse you suffered. Somebody walked into a room when Savile was abusing you, who apparently said oops and then left abruptly. Were you able to give information to the police about that person?
Yeah, I've gave them what I would call a very good description. The man was quite distinctive, so hopefully that they'll be able to trace him through the information that I've given them.
How do you reflect now, Kevin, on the fact that you kept this a secret for so long?
It's very hard. I find at the moment it the easiest thing in the world to talk about, and I'm just so gutted, so disappointed in myself that I never said this while Jimmy Savile was alive, and I would just love to have seen him brought to justice, but obviously that's never going to happen. But it's just a whole bag of mixed emotions.
In what sense, Kevin?
There's anger because, like I say, nothing can ever happen. Justice for me. There's like feeling of disappointment that obviously I'm speaking about it almost every day now, publicly, and obviously I didn't have the courage to do it previously. And then there's anger. Because if I would have said something, abuse took place in 1976, if I would have said something after that, then I could have possibly put a stop to the victims, being abused after myself, and that I have to live with.
Mark Williams-Thomas, have you come across those kind of mixture of emotions from other people you've talked to?
Yeah, I think, Kevin, let me talk directly to you. Let me be very clear to you, Kevin, and I'm sure that the police officers probably reiterated this again. Jimmy Savile was an adult, you were a child. Jimmy Savile is entirely responsible for his actions, and in no way must you blame yourself at all. The fact that you weren't able to speak out is something that the offenders prey on. They prey on the vulnerability of children, and they play on the power and the control that they have. And don't forget, Jimmy Savile was an incredibly powerful person. It was very difficult for anybody to talk out in terms of any sexual abuse, but even harder when you're talking about someone who had such celebrity status as he did. So you mustn't blame yourself. The strength that you now have is that having come forward, you are enabling other people to come forward. So take the positive elements out of it. You are I'm incredibly proud of you and anybody else that's come forward and talked as far as victims. And let's see if we can now move into a new era where we are addressing the issues, we are believing children, we are listening to children, and hopefully we can make it easier to collect that evidence. And I think both the criminal justice system, policing system need to look again and say, can we do more to take accounts from children so that we are not entirely reliant on their evidence? Can we investigate these things better?
Yeah, thanks. Obviously, it's a great comfort to, hear someone, like yourself, sort of, saying it with the courage, but, I just wish I had it all them years ago.
Listen, you're a child, Kevin. Your courage that you show now, having come forward and talked about it, is the courage. And people will be listening to this going, you're an incredibly brave man, and so are all those other people. And I talk here very highly of the 5 that came forward, because if they hadn't come forward, we wouldn't now be in a position where we have opened up the watershed in relation to those victims that come forward. And very clearly, if you are an offender out there, and obviously we move away from Savile, but if you are an offender out there in any way, you've abused against a child, and you will know whether you are, you should be sleeping very lightly now, because I can assure you that not only those that I know about, that I've passed the information on to the police, and I'm in very regular contact with them and almost daily receiving new accounts from people, but the police themselves are receiving lots of information, and the police forces out there are receiving new allegations. So if you are an offender out there, your time might be up, because this is the biggest position that we've ever been in, where victims are now taking the power, the strength to come forward, give their allegations, and finally, hopefully, be in a position where they're being listened to.
Yeah, hopefully, like you say, if people can find the courage to come forward, then obviously, people that are doing these sort of things, and like you say, they will be sleeping very lightly, and hopefully they'll all be brought to justice.
Mark, as a result of further investigations that you've made, and for a follow-up programme for ITV, I understand that you now believe that Savile used his power, his status, to create programmes to help him deliberately target children. Is that right?
Yeah, when we first looked at this, we were looking with regards to the victims in a very, very, very tight time frame. It was between the 70s and 80s. What we are now clear of is his offending behaviour that we know of began in the 1950s, and the last report we know is in the mid-1990s. That's a very clear span of timeline. And what we also know is the times that he became involved with regards to his early radio profile and television profile, which is obviously Radio Luxembourg, Radio 1, Savile Travels, Top of the Pops, Jim Will Fix It. And it's clear to show now, through the evidence that we've gathered, through forensic analysis of both the information we've got from him, the information we got from victims and from other people, is that it was clear that his offending behaviour began prior to him getting into the media spotlight. And what he did, because he was an incredibly cunning, calculated, controlling individual that he got into a position whereby he created some of, not all of, but some of the television programs, the radio programs, which would deliberately give him access to children. You know, in particular Savile Travels, that gave him access driving around the country in his mobile home, where we know that during and the course of those travels that there were children that were abused by him. So there was an opportunity that he created, and the element of anyone's offending behaviour is both to create access and opportunity. If you have both of those, you are in a position to offend, and that's clearly what he did. And we're now in a position to be able to show. Obviously he's not here, so we're not in a position to put that to him. But forensically, I am confident now that what we've shown and what we've been able to work with is that here is an individual who was a clear predatory child sex offender, which is being reiterated by the police and the NSPCC, who targeted children and put himself in a position where he gained access to them. And if we look at the programs that he made, nearly all of them involved access to children.
And that is the nature of paedophiles. They create scenarios whereby they can be with children, whether they're in a teaching environment, or the clergy, or scout leaders, or whatever.
Absolutely, and I think the other thing about Savile, and this is something that victims find it always very difficult to talk about in respect of him, it was just how powerful he was. This was a man that infiltrated every element of society, from the royal family to members of government to institutions, places where he worked, to charities. And if you look at all of those, what he was trying to do is to create this persona, this controlling element that enabled him to have access in order that he could offend. Now, that is borne out by some of the figures and the numbers of people who have come forward to say that they are victims of his. The numbers will be considerably more than what we know, because what we also know as child abuse is that not everybody will come forward. Some of those may have died, some of those may have moved away, so there will be more than that 300 that we know about. But I hope that moving forward, and we've lost a bit of the focus over the last couple of days, over the last week, so because of course that focus has turned towards the BBC, and whilst the BBC, other organisations, Broadmoor, Stoke Mandeville, have questions that need answering, we must remain what is the whole purpose of my programme, the whole purpose of these people speaking forward, and the whole purpose of the strength that Kevin had to come forward, and that is about child abuse. Let's keep the focus on child abuse, let's keep talking about it, let's make it so that we're in a confident position that if you are a victim of child abuse, you now have the confidence that not only will you be listened to, but action will be taken. And I hope this is a wake-up time for both police and the criminal justice system to start thinking, we've got to do this better, because at times in the past we've let people down.
Does the failed Newsnight report potentially damage the prospect of victims coming forward because they will be worried about not being believed potentially?
Well, I think that was a concern that I had, and I'm very pleased to hear that the Children's Commission of Wales has obviously received some phone calls as a result of that. So that's very positive, because of course had that piece not have run on Newsnight, we wouldn't now be talking about the North Wales inquiry for Inestin, and we certainly wouldn't be in a position where those new accounts, allegations were going to the Children's Commissioner for Wales, who was a very, very competent individual. So I'm very pleased, and I think all the negativity that perhaps has surrounded all of that, I think let's take the positive elements of it and say that actually as a result of that Newsnight investigation, we've now opened up another line of inquiry where abuse has potentially not been properly investigated.
Kevin, how, broadly speaking, how have you coped with the media attention over the last few weeks?
It's been hard. Initially, I did the interview for the Sun newspaper. A bit naively, I thought that would be it. And then on the Monday when it came out, there was a deluge of TV and press sort of chasing me around my house, and which obviously I couldn't understand. But the longer it's gone on, obviously, like I say, because I've spoken out, it is becoming easier to speak about. So when I'm invited on these programs, you know, I mean, I sort of do them, and in the back of my mind, I'm just hoping that I'm helping. If I could just help one person, you know, especially as being a male, it was like really hard to come forward. And even now, I think I only know of 2 males that have come forward. I'm assuming that because of the numbers that have, allegedly come forward, that there's going to be more. Once you've done it, you do get used to it, but at the same time, you lie in bed thinking about it, and it does sort of keep it all fresh, and it brings all the memories back when you're just trying to bury them.
Lee in Birmingham is listening to you speak, Kevin. He sent this text to me, which I'd like to read to you. Please thank Kevin for his incredible bravery. He is helping children now who are being abused. I'm not brave enough to speak of it, even now when my abuser is also dead. Kevin, on our behalf, I'm telling you, you are a hero.
Yeah, no, far from that. I mean, the five ladies that spoke out initially, for them to come forward and do what they've done, I mean, that is an incredibly brave thing to do. Obviously, there was no other people that had come forward, and for them, to be the first ones to, they're the brave ones, not myself.
Mark Williams-Thomas, there are now several inquiries. We have police investigations, 2 inquiries the Prime Minister set up into North Wales, several at the BBC. What do you think about the number set up?
Yeah, I mean, I think we clearly have to learn lessons from this, and that's the key element. My concern always is with inquiries that are set up within organisations. They're not being set up with the individual parameters that are being designed by that organisation. They're not truly independent, and that potentially causes a problem. I think what we have to do now is to wait for the response that comes from those independent inquiries, see what the outcome is, and then see whether we need to do some more. The problem, of course, potentially, is that who's pulling all that data together, who's actually going to learn the lessons from it. And you'll see from my next program, which is trying to create more of a pull together a timeline, a forensic examination of Jimmy Savile, and to try to look to see whether organisations were accountable in any elements of Jimmy Savile's work, is that the clear point that I make and the theme that runs through it is that this is about child abuse, and this is about what do we need to do as a society, as organisations, as authorities, to make it easier for children to come forward and report those allegations, and most importantly, what can we do better within the criminal justice system to make sure that those allegations get to court and get properly dealt with through the criminal justice system.
Here's a text from Tony in Tunbridge Wells, Mark, which I'll put to you. Victim Steve Measham has not found peace for making a simple mistake for which he has apologised. He has been vilified by some parts of the print media. This is not likely to encourage other victims to come forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think with regards to Steve, I've been in contact with him. I've obviously seen some of the correspondence and the communications being written about him, and I have been incredibly supportive of him, both through my tweets and the general correspondence that I've said about him. I think we've got to be very careful. I wrote a piece, or was in a piece last week in The Guardian, with regards to, we have to be very careful that we don't use victims as a vehicle for other people's gain. And I think in terms of summing that up, it was about, these are vulnerable people. These takes weeks and months of investigations. It took me 10 months to get 5 people confident enough to talk on camera to expose the Jimmy Savile investigation. This is something that you can't do overnight or in a matter of days. You need to build their confidence, you need to get their trust, and you need to be in a position where you're going to honour that and take great care of them. And that is why, with all the people that I've spoken to, all those people that appeared in our programme, there was a great aftercare package in relation to them. So, I don't know enough with regards to Steve specifically, but quite clearly, we need to look after people when we involve them in the media. It's the very first time they've been in. Kevin himself talked about, he worries about when he does a media interview what the result and what the impact of that is going to be. And that's very difficult, for those people to have to handle, particularly when they've not been in the spotlight. Even people who are in the media spotlight every single day, and even those that work for organisations that are media organisations, they still struggle sometimes to handle the issues of doing interviews and talking to the media. You put that onto somebody who is a victim who's having to deal with an account, horrendous abuse they've suffered, and you can just kind of understand how difficult that is.
Thank you both very much for coming on the programme this morning. We appreciate it. Kevin, thanks for your time. Kevin Cook and Mark Williams-Thomas, who is currently filming a follow-up programme.
I think it's incredibly positive, and those figures you've just given borne that out, because what we're now moved into a position where people are far more confident to come forward and report, and I hope that is a legacy that comes out of the programme. I created that programme and managed to get it to air, but let's be very clear that the only reason that that programme came about is because of the strength of the 5 women who gave up their anonymity to a degree, and in some degrees completely, in order for us to tell that story. It was a very strong programme. It put evidence out there, and as a result of that, we've now got the Metropolitan Police, the commander of the Metropolitan Police, clearly coming out and saying that Jimmy Savile was a predatory child sex offender, of which there are in excess now of 300 people that have come to the police, and indeed other charities have received that as well. So I think...
Where do the continuing revelations about Jimmy Savile and the failed Newsnight report leave victims of sexual abuse? The National Association for People Abused in Childhood have told us that since the start of October, they've had 7,898 calls to their support line about abuse in general. They'd normally expect 1,500 to 2,000 in the same period. They say that around 40 of those calls were specifically about Savile. The NSPCC tell us they've now had 260 calls to Childline specifically about abuse linked to Jimmy Savile, and a further increase in calls about other abuse allegations. The Metropolitan Police has confirmed they've now spoken to 130 of the 300 victims.
We've moved into what's described by some as a watershed moment, and I hope that it's given confidence to people to come forward. And I know, in addition to those figures you've given, that the police forces, of which there are 43, almost every single one of those, there are reports in regards to historic child abuse. So those are allegations that are being made now about abuse that's happened in the past, has significantly increased. That has to be a positive step, and I think we've moved now into an era whereby I hope victims, not all of them, but a large majority of victims have the strength to come forward. And I have to say, I'm working closely with Operation Youre, which is the Savile investigation. I have total confidence in them. They are determined to get to the bottom of this, and more so in relation to
historical sexual abuse, are looking into 17 separate complaints made since the 28th of October. 2 men have been arrested. Let's talk to 2 people about this. Kevin Cook says he was abused by Jimmy Savile when he was 9 years old, after his Cub Scout group appeared on Jim'll Fix It, and he's waived his right to anonymity to speak to us this morning. Good morning, Kevin. Welcome to the programme.
Good morning. Thank you.
Also with us, Mark Williams-Thomas, the child protection expert and former police detective who led the investigation into victims of Jimmy Savile for ITV's Tonight programme. He's currently filming a follow-up programme. Mr. Williams-Thomas, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Where do you think all that's happened in the last 6-8 weeks or so leaves victims of abuse now? Who've come forward with allegations by Savile. They've also arrested 3 men in connection with this. All 3 are currently on bail. And Surrey Police, where Jimmy Savile is alleged to have targeted young teenagers at the Duncroft Approved School for Girls, say they've had a big increase in the number of abuse allegations they've received in the last month and a half, although they couldn't give us specific figures. The Children's Commissioner for Wales, Keith Towler, has told this programme that as a result of the now discredited Newsnight report into allegations against a senior politician, he's been contacted by 36 people, all of whom say they were the victims of abuse as children, 22 of them linked to the Brynestyn Care Children's Home. And this morning we've heard that police in Manchester investigating allegations of his